Welcome to the first video in a series of videos talking about the nature of slavery and why the current world that you live in is actually embodied in the nature of slavery. How the whole world is actually engaging and actively promoting slavery without their own conscious understanding of what slavery actually is, what it has always been throughout history, and how their mind has been manipulated into accepting that slavery that they now tout upon the rest of the population. Join us as you watch this video series, for it will deliver the most in-depth solution and action that you can take within your own life that's practical, that will get us from point A to point B, that is a free world, a world that is the antithesis of slavery, that is true freedom. Let everybody know about this docu-series, because this will go into the philosophy, the psychology, the deeper elements that most do not want to look into because it's too difficult to understand. It involves a self-transformation, an action of looking at the shadows within our own life and seeing that we ourselves may be at fault or have been partaking in actions that actually legitimize and make our problem worse and not better. We need to get to the root cause of the problem, and this will go exactly into that. This is Slavery Gone for Good, the most important work in history. Indeed, the work has still yet to be done, and history has only yet to tell us time and time again. As a preface to sum up the entirety of this work, quote, "No wonder that the slaves themselves who have always been enslaved do not understand their own position, and that this condition in which they have always lived is considered by them to be natural to human life, and that they hail as a relief any change in their form of slavery. No wonder that their owners sometimes quite sincerely think they are, in a measure, freeing the slaves by slacking one screw, though they are compelled to do so by the overtension of another. Both become accustomed to their state, and the slaves, never having known what freedom is, merely seek an alleviation or only the change of their condition. The other, the owners, wishing to mask their injustice, try to assign a particular meaning to those new forms of slavery which they enforce in place of the older ones." This is a quote from Leo Tolstoy. Why talk about slavery? Well, by understanding what is slavery, you can understand what is freedom. This process of knowing what is from what is not is known as apophysis. The subject of slavery may be touchy for humankind, yet it is a necessary one to address, considering the fact that it has existed for thousands of years, despite many moral disputes and implications. How could that be? Additionally, if we want to end all forms of injustice in the world, it would help for us to understand one that humanity has long struggled with. We cannot expect slavery to be merely abolished, as we will discover upon observing the very nature of slavery. Frederick Douglass told us, "I did not know I was a slave until I found out I couldn't do the things I wanted." And there's a quote that's disputed, attributed to Harriet Tubman, where she states, "If I could have convinced more slaves that they were slaves, I could have freed thousands more." Nonetheless, Leo Tolstoy tells us again, not only the greatest sages of the world, the teachers of humanity, Plato and Aristotle, justified the existence of slaves and proved the legality of it, but even 3 centuries ago, men who wrote of the imaginary society of the future, of utopia, could not imagine it without slaves. Slavery was contrary to all the moral principles which were preached by Plato and Aristotle, and yet neither the one nor the other saw this, because the negation of slavery destroyed all that life which they lived. The same happens in our world. So what is slavery? It's the claim of ownership over the life of another individual or their property, or the involuntary servitude of an individual's labor to another, or the control over the life of another by threat of violence. From the Etymology dictionary from the 1550s, severe toil, hard work, drudgery, state of servitude, condition of a slave, entire subjection to the will and commands of another. A slave from the late 1200s is defined as a person who is the chattel or property of another. This originates with Slav due to the many Slavic people being sold into slavery due to conquering and war. Slav is defined as one of the people who inhabit most of Eastern Europe, a shortening of a word meaning word or speech, which suggests the representation of people who are foreign, of a different voice, or dumb, more specifically different in both race and language. In this word, slave and Slav actually relates to the word robot from Old Slavic, meaning slave. Slaveholder or slave master is defined from 1776 as one who owns a slave or slaves, and slave driver is defined from 1807 as overseer of slaves at their work, or as cruel or exhausting taskmaster from 1854. So slavery is known to have different forms. For instance, chattel slavery is the form many people are familiar with due to the abolitionist movement in the 19th century. Ralph Waldo Emerson tells us that slavery it is that makes slavery, freedom, freedom. The slavery of women happened when men were slaves of kings. Kevin Bales, a professor, tells us that slavery is theft, theft of a life, theft of work, theft of any property or produce, theft even of the children a slave might have borne.
Slavery is what slavery's always been. It's about one person controlling another person using violence, or the threat of violence, exploiting them economically, paying them absolutely nothing. It's really about when a person can't walk away from the situation they're in, and that someone's controlling their free will, and then using that situation to make money off them. That's what slavery's about.
Ayn Rand, a philosopher and well-known author, tells us the man who produces while others dispose of his product is a slave. Tolstoy tells us the necessity to do what other people wish against your own will is slavery, and therefore as long as any violence designed to compel some people to do the will of others exists, there will be slavery. Henry Clark Wright, an abolitionist, tells us that slavery is the submission or subjection to control by the will of another being. EndSlaveryNow.org tells us that slavers and human traffickers grossly violate human rights since they claim ownership, labor, and/or the humanity of another human being. The abolitionist William Batchelder Greene tells us, what is it to be a slave? It is to have the inward knowledge of that which is great and holy, and to be constrained to do tilings that are small and base. It is to be a person consciously capable of self-government, and to be at the same time subject to the will of another person. It is to be a full-grown person whose actual rights are those of a child only. It is to see the blazing star and not be permitted to follow it. Francis Dashwood Tandy, a philosopher, tells us the savage found it to his advantage to spare the life of his enemy in order to make him a slave. Now, when I mention chattel slavery being this form most people are familiar with, what is it? It's the complete ownership of one individual by another. The claim over 100% of somebody's labor or property. The use of involuntary free labor. Individuals under this condition are under duress or the continued threat of violence. This form is also known as overt physical slavery or ball and chains slavery. From the Etymology dictionary, chattel comes from the early 13th century, meaning property or goods. Also from Old French, wealth, possessions, property, cattle. The word cattle also means property of any kind, including money, land, or income. Also from Middle English as movable property or livestock. Ralph Waldo Emerson tells us that slavery is an institution for converting men into monkeys. One of the most notorious abolitionists in the 19th century was William Lloyd Garrison, who was the main editor of the Liberator newspaper, which he held for 35 consecutive years without missing a single weekly edition. And he wrote this in regards to the aggregate end of chattel slavery within the United States due to his efforts. we commence a new decade with the same confidence in the principles we espouse, the same assurance of success in the cause we advocate, that we felt at the commencement of our labors, only greatly strengthened by the experience gained and the progress made toward the goal of final victory. It has been a long, desperate, and humanly speaking, most unequal struggle with the organized religious sentiment, the political power, the combined wealth, the recognized respectability, the popular feeling, the business selfishness, the satanic malignity, and the universal brutality and ruffianism of the country. But from the hour the bugle of freedom first sounded its notes in favor of immediate and universal emancipation, the movement has advanced with slow but irresistible power under divine guidance, confounding the wisdom of the wise, contemning the might of the strong, taking the cunning in their own craftiness, unmasking the hypocritical, swallowing up all the rods of the magicians, breaking sects and parties into fragments, vanquishing all opponents, its poverty more than a match for all the wealth of the land, its spirit sublime and unconquerable, its truths self-evident, and its results glorious in the annals of historic achievement. And still, against the wind, against the tide, it steadies with upright keel, outstripping all competition, and with the haven of righteousness and peace full in view. Now, Garrison was willing to speak of controversial topics in regards to suffering laborers, school systems, women's rights, capital punishment, the treatment of Indians, animal rights, alcoholism, and much more. To be reminded of this passion and strife, we may become inspired for what change may be needed in the modern day. During the times of 19th century abolition, pro-slavery advocate Senator Hammond of South Carolina stated, quote, "The great strength of the South arises from the harmony of her political and social institutions. This harmony gives her a frame of society the best in the world and an extent of political freedom combined with entire security and as no other people ever enjoyed upon the face of the earth. In all social systems there must be a class to do the mean duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is a class requiring but a low order of intellect and but little skill. Such a class you must have, or you would not have the other class which leads progress, refinement, and civilization. It constitutes the very mudsills of society and of political government. Fortunately for the South, she has found a race adapted to that purpose to her hand, a race inferior to herself, but eminently qualified in temper, in vigor, in docility, in capacity to stand the climate, to answer all her purposes. We use them for the purpose and call them slaves. We are old-fashioned in the South, yet it is a word discarded now by ears polite. But I will not characterize that class at the North with that term. But you have it. It is there. It is everywhere. It is eternal. Northern laborers are but slaves." Many pro-slavery newspapers would attack the efforts of abolitionists, such as the New York Courier and Inquirer, having an article titled, "Shall the government be preserved or the abolitionists have their will?" saying, quote, "Do you, fellow citizens, feel this disregard for the Constitution of your country? Are you ready to do an act that from the very nature of things must plunge this great nation into confusion and disaster, and then stand with impious lips to charge the calamity upon your God? We trust not. We will not suffer ourselves to entertain so foul a suspicion of our countrymen." Next time you go out into the world, ask yourself, are people making these similar arguments where they say that civilization will not operate unless we actually put certain classes down and push other classes up at the expense of the lower classes, and say that certain people may be inferior, or say that certain people have more rights than others, or say that the freedom fighters of the world are actually causing confusion and disaster, and that, we should actually not embrace a higher intellect, but a lower order of intellect and little skill, and recognize that it's natural and part of society and universal and eternal. But no, humankind can be empowered. They can see the truth that they own themselves. Thank you for watching this part of the docu-series Slavery Gone for Good. Be sure to watch our other parts for a more deep understanding as to the nature of truth and action in its fullest extent. If you want to learn more and hear more quotes that have not been discussed in this video, be sure to buy the book Slavery Gone for Good Black Book Edition. This is the most important work in history, and you are part of that work. Do not forget it. As Frederick Douglass, former slave and abolitionist, said, "Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave."